Thank you. It is a joy to be with you all this morning. As was noted in my bio at the beginning, I typically live and serve as a Unitarian Universalist minister in Cheyenne, Wyoming, which is not that close to here, as you may have realized. In fact, I had my ID checked for something the other day, and the person who was checking it said, this is the first driver's license I've ever seen from Wyoming. It's like, well, I'm glad that our very underpopulated state can represent here. But my mother grew up in Somerset, and her mother is from the Bridgeton area, and so we're here for vacation. And I contacted Dawn, and luckily they said, oh yeah, you can come. So here I am. A note before I offer this morning's reading is that in the course of wrestling with the question, what do we do about our heroes who disappoint us? It became clear that I felt that we would inevitably need to talk, at least adjacently, about the conversations happening in our society about questions around inappropriate behavior and the Me Too movement. Now, what I'll talk about in my sermon is going to be, I will say, vastly less graphic than anything you would hear on your evening news. Right? It's going to be more about what we do after the fact, what we do in response. But if this tender topic touches your heart, I encourage you to reach out for support to the pastoral structures in this congregation, to your own support network. And if this touches something in your own story that makes it just too much to listen at that given moment, I will be the opposite of offended if you need to take yourself out of the room. So this morning's reading is from the 7th book in the Harry Potter series, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. And by this point in the series, Harry and his friends are off on their own journey, fighting the battle against evil. And as often happens as people get older and start to discover things about the heroes that they thought they knew, Harry and Hermione, his much smarter best friend, start to learn some troubling things in a posthumous biography of their hero, Albus Dumbledore. And the book itself was written by a noted gossip columnist, Rita Skeeter. And even wizards have problems with gossip columnists. Right? But Rita Skeeter has written a scathing book, some of which is gossip, but some of which is true. And it reveals some complicated history, that Albus Dumbledore in his youth was friends with someone who would become a terrible dark wizard, Gellert Grindelwald. Everyone has great names in the series. And so the reading this morning, even if you don't have any of the background from the series, the reading this morning is a conversation between two friends as they try to grapple with the impact of discovering that their hero and their mentor was not exactly who he said he was. Rita's book lay on the ground between them, and so that the face of Albus Dumbledore was smiling dolefully up at them. Harry, I'm sorry, said Hermione, but I think the real reason you're so angry is that Dumbledore never told you any of this himself. Maybe I am, Harry bellowed, and he flung his arms over his head, hardly knowing whether he was trying to hold in his anger or protect himself from the weight of his own disillusionment. Look what he asked from me, Hermione. Risk your life, Harry, and again, and again. And don't expect me to explain everything, just trust me, blind me. Trust that I know what I'm doing. Trust me even though I don't trust you. Never the whole truth, never. Harry's voice cracked with the strain, and they stood looking at each other in the whiteness and the emptiness, and Harry felt that they were as insignificant as insects beneath the wide sky. "He loved you," Hermione whispered. "I know he loved you." Harry dropped his arms. "I don't know who he loved, Hermione, but it was never me. This isn't love, this mess he's left me in." He shared more of what he was really thinking with Gellert Grindelwald than he ever shared with me. Harry picked up Hermione's wand, which he had dropped in the snow, and sat back down at the entrance of their tent. "Thanks for the tea. I'll finish the watch. You get back inside to keep warm." She hesitated, but recognized the dismissal. She picked up the book and then walked past him into the tent, and as she did so, she brushed the top of his head lightly with her hand. He closed his eyes at her touch and hated himself for wishing that what she said was true, that Dumbledore had really cared. So before I lived in Baltimore, I was a student at Arizona State University. And I was enrolled in the Honors College there. And one of the classes that you had to take if you were a member of the Honors College was it was called the Human Event, which is sort of a very self-important name for an Intro to Philosophy seminar. And the professors, it was taught by professors who were part of the Honors College faculty, and they were encouraged to build relationships with students, and it was your opportunity as a freshman to get to know the faculty. And my professor for that class, Dr. Susser, was really charismatic and smart. Right? And I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot about how to construct really clever arguments about really relevant to my life things like Beowulf, which I use so often. Right? And I learned a lot about how to write academic prose. And I had a great time. And Dr. Susser and a number of other faculty in the college were also engaged in deeply inappropriate behavior and relationships with my classmates. And they had been for years. It was an open secret until a handful of victims came forward on the record, and Dr. Susser and a number of other professors were dismissed for violating university policy. And when that happened, nobody with eyes to see and ears to hear was surprised or found anything that we didn't already really know about in the Phoenix New Times expose about it that was published eventually in 2015. It was that open secret about these professors who were idolized and put on pedestals by so many students. And I know that I am not the only person in this room with a story about that kind of open secret in an institution, whether it was a university or a congregation or a workplace or a family, about a people or a person that we were so encouraged to put on that pedestal. And at the same time, everybody knew that there was something deeply wrong happening. We see it again and again and again, right? That people who we see as heroes disappoint us. And so I've been wondering if we experience this kind of disappointment so consistently, why do we keep making heroes Why do we keep needing them? What is it about what they do for us, for our communities, for our stories, and for ourselves? What is it about them that we keep turning people into heroes, even though we keep setting ourselves up for disappointment? All right, why do we keep creating them, whether they are real or fictional, or, as is most often the case, frankly, somewhere in between those two poles? And I keep coming back to two things, right? Two things that heroes do for us that lead us to keep creating them again and again. And the first is that heroes can show us what is possible. Right? Heroes can show us how it is that we can take our gifts and use them to do good in incredibly difficult times. One of them that I think about as a hero who does this, right, who shows us what's possible, is from the Harry Potter books, Hermione, right, who is, I just feel, factually seen as the brains of the rescue operations for her friends Harry and Ron. And Hermione has a consistent commitment to use her intellect for good, even at great personal cost. At the beginning of the 7th book, right, she even goes to her parents, who are non-magical people, and so throughout the course of the series, we don't really learn anything about them other than that they're dentists. But at the beginning of the 7th book, when she's getting ready to quit school and go fight evil full time, she realizes that her parents' knowledge about her could be used as a weapon, right? That they might be pumped or tortured for information. And so before she sets off, she goes and erases her own parents' memories of her to protect them. Right? She uses her incredible magical gifts and her intellect for the greater service of good, even at great personal cost. And superheroes show us this too, right? The sort of the spandex-clad hero set. Right? I think about the movie Black Panther and how T'Challa, right, the main character, is able to face multiple challenges to his authority. Right, from a variety of different sources. And he is able to maintain his authority as king of Wakanda and persevere with help and prevail, but never betrays his values. Right? Heroes show us what's possible if we're willing to use our gifts with integrity. And the other thing that heroes give us, right, that makes us keep coming back for more from them, is that they cultivate hope in us. Heroes, especially those we make out of our own human history, remind us that we are not the first people to have a hard time, right? We're not the first people to struggle against injustice. And they can help build hope in us by showing us that other people have faced problems and persevered. Right? They lead by example. Right? In the Harry Potter books, right, the main character, Harry, derives great strength from learning that his parents were part of the first resistance movement against Voldemort. Right? That's a source of incredible personal strength for him. Right? That he is part of a long history of people doing the right thing. And he spends a lot of energy making his father and his father's friends into heroes in his mind. I think about stories of the civil rights movements of generations past, right? That those heroes teach us how to keep going when things seem difficult. I think about the Martin Luther Kings and the Susan B. Anthonys. But, of course, making people who are human and fallible into heroes has its pitfalls. Right? As Harry Potter learns when he sees a memory that involves his father being an extremely petty bully when he was a student. right? And just like happened for me, right? I was raised Unitarian Universalist, so I like had little ditties about Susan B. Anthony. We were like, I was coloring pictures of her, all of that. And it was an incredible shock to my system when, as I grew up, I learned that she had engaged in deeply racist rhetoric out of her frustration that black men had been given to the right to vote before white women. So what do we do? What do we do when our heroes inevitably disappoint us? What do we do? Sometimes what we need to do is just acknowledge the complexity of human beings. As the religious educator Gail Forsyth Vail says, our ancestors were capable of great insight and great oversight. Right? That these heroes we're building were human beings, which means that they, like us, like me and like you, are flawed. They will fail. They will fumble. They will not be perfect all the time. Right? And in fact, we love those complex characters in literature, right? We love the Severus Snapes of this world, right? Whose motivations we can't quite figure out and who sometimes do the right thing for the wrong reasons or the wrong thing for the right reasons. We love those complex characters in our stories. And maybe we need to find a way for some of those complex characters in our human history and our lives. But of course, then we run up against a complicated question, which is how to find the distinction between the reality that human beings are imperfect, flawed, complicated things, right? And finding that room for those flawed people, those flawed ancestors and characters and heroes who teach us to acknowledge that life and our motivations in it are often way more multifaceted than we like to admit, or than is convenient to admit. Right? A distinction between that and between truly predatory people who may be very smart and talented, but who have a trail of victims in their wake. Sort of a public intellectual who has done a fair amount of thinking and writing about this is Professor Roxane Gay, who wrote an essay where she talks about grappling with the legacy of Bill Cosby, right? That she grew up black and middle class in the 80s, and so the Cosby Show during her childhood was a hugely formative part of becoming an artist and a writer. And in that wrestling, she comes to this conclusion. I no longer struggle with artistic legacies. It is not difficult for me to dismiss the work of predators and angry men, because agonizing over a predator's legacy would mean that there is some price I am willing to let victims pay for the sake of good art. When the truth is that no half hour of television is so excellent that anyone's suffering is recompense. No half hour of television, or 2 hours of film, or 3 minutes of music, or 20 minutes of preaching is so excellent that anyone's suffering is recompense. Right, and that work, right, trying to distinguish between who is simply a regular old-fashioned flawed human being, right, and who is engaged in the kind of predatory behavior that necessitates truly declaring them to have been so problematic that we need to set their work in history and move on. I have no answers. I feel like this is always the part in the sermon where I'm like, I don't know. Right? Because I don't know. I don't know if any of us do. How we find the difference and that distinction and that discernment, but I know that it is work we must do together. And as we struggle with these questions about the heroes who disappoint us and the people whose legacies we're trying to figure out what to do with, right, the Harry Potter series actually spends a great deal of time devoted to that question, right? About discovering that the person that you put up on that pedestal has not been who they said they were their whole lives. And for me, part of the lesson there is that when we put a person on a pedestal and we expect them to be the full and complete embodiment of wisdom or goodness or truth or insight or virtue, when we put someone up on a pedestal and expect them to live their lives so completely in those virtues that they could not be capable of anything else, we will inevitably be disappointed. Because that is a superhuman expectation. It's impossible for anyone to fulfill it. Right? And that's what Harry finds out when he discovers that Professor Dumbledore was a selfish young man. But in some ways, more than the inevitable fall from the pedestal and disappointment, for me, more troubling is that when we lionize people like this and we put them on those pedestals, what we often do is we abdicate our responsibility for holding them accountable. And we let bad behavior go unchecked for years, even decades, until we get to the point that things cannot be resolved. And we feel we have to answer a question about whether we can engage with their legacies anymore at all. Right? That's what happens when we put people on the pedestal, is that it becomes this self-reinforcing cycle where we're not allowed to hold them accountable. Even though everyone, the person on the pedestal included, would be better served by somebody holding them accountable for their behavior. Right, when the expose about my undergrad program was published, right, I was torn between feeling heartened that these professors had been held accountable for their actions. And I felt torn between that sense of like, ha, yes, and a deep sense of shame that I had participated, however briefly or passively, in the cult of personality that allowed this behavior to persist for so many years. Right? Feeling torn because I knew in my heart that I had participated in the culture that let it happen, in laughing off jokes, in just accepting that this was some sort of inevitable feature of college life, that professors would behave inappropriately with undergraduate students. When in fact, all myself and all of my classmates and all of the administration, we all had a responsibility to hold people accountable for their behavior. But it was seen as impossible to hold these people accountable because we had put them up on a pedestal where they were above reproach. And again, we see how that kind of lionizing of heroes does not serve us. It does not serve the greater cause of justice because it lets us tap out and say that we can't hold that person accountable. No one could ever call out that person's inappropriate behavior, when that simply isn't true. That each and every one of us has a responsibility to hold people accountable, to say that the way you are behaving is not in line with your values, and we need to talk about that. Not a gotcha or a smackdown or something like that, but a real honest engagement around accountability. Because the work of building a more just world is really hard, it turns out. Right? The work, and you all have seen this again and again as you have put up a rainbow flag and how it had it defaced and stolen. Right? That work is hard. It's a long slog out there. And we need people to be able to teach us to hope and to show us what's possible. But if we fail to hold one another accountable in that journey, we will inevitably end up disappointed. Human beings are hard sometimes. That's what I often say when people ask me, like, how do you like being a minister? And I say, people are hard. But we are also filled with possibility. We also have incredible capacity to do amazing things. And so, I invite you and all of us to tap into your own capacity and to know that while heroes sometimes teach us important things, that the ones who have the real power, both to hold them accountable for their actions and to do the work of changing this world, that the real power is with you. Because you have the capacity to say the true thing, the hard thing, the loving thing. May we all find ways to say the true thing, the loving thing, and the hard thing to ourselves and maybe even to our heroes. May it be so. Amen.